So, my name is Noah Lee, and my presentation for you guys today is called The Evolution of Music in Games. So, firstly, a short introduction about me. I'm an interactive media and game design student, so I'm a game designer. I played the violin for 10 plus years, and that orchestral experience that I have has given me a passion for music and especially for music in games. And because of that, I'm also a music composer. Also, I compose my own music. I have about 60 plus tracks right now. And I'm just utterly obsessed with video game official soundtracks or OSTs, which is what caused me to want to create this presentation because I personally find it really interesting. And hopefully, you guys find it interesting as well. I'm just going to go through the table of contents real quick for exactly what this presentation is going to cover. Firstly, we're going to clear up some quick misconceptions about audio and about this presentation for a second. Number two, I'm going to talk about the role that music plays in games. Three, we're going to talk about the 8-bit era of gaming and analyze the song Green Greens from Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy Color. Next, we'll go to the 16-bit era of gaming and analyze Angel Island Zone Act 2 from the Sega Genesis, or that was on the Sega Genesis. Next, we'll go through sampling advancements by comparing and analyzing Ecruteak City from Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal and Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Then we'll go to orchestral music becoming integrated into soundtracks. And then lastly, we'll go over how indie developers have rebranded retro music to be back into the main spotlight. I also want to point out that all questions should be saved to the very end. And I think I can't see chat right now, even if I wanted to, because of my screen sharing settings. So I can't even see it. So first, clearing up some misconceptions. So what is commonly referred to as 8-bit music is actually called chiptune. 8-bit refers to video game console microprocessors that were only able to produce 8 bits. These consoles only had 256 places to store data. So when we're talking about actual 8 bits, that's how distorted sound is in terms of audio. So here's an example of a sound clip at 8 bits right here. And so you see that sounds like pretty realistic, sounds like a guitar. And 8 bits isn't even as high as it goes. That's just an example. And then the lower bits you go, you can see in these graphs that it's becoming more square and the sound waves aren't being completely overlapped. And you can hear that in the sound. You can hear that one sounds a little bit more distorted. And then lastly, I'm not going to play this one for long because it's kind of extremely distorted, but you kind of get the picture. It they don't sound as great with less bits when it comes to audio. So 8-bit really refers to the processing power of the game consoles and the graphics more than the actual sound, but that's kind of just been carried over. And that same nomenclature is used for 16-bit and 32-bit. But like I said, those aren't actually representative of what kind of music is being played. Secondly, while this presentation contains information on some of the technical intricacies of video game console sound chips, this presentation will mostly be talking about the techniques that composers used to create music despite having massive limitations. And there will be a lot of listening to music involved. So hopefully you have earphones or I don't know, you're just in the mindset to listen for a little bit because it's a very audio focused presentation. So the first section, the role that music plays in video games. We'll be listening to some iconic pieces of music for about 40 to 1.5 minutes each. If you recall any of these pieces, do you know what game it is from? What was the situation in the game? And how did you feel? If you don't remember any of these songs, can you imagine the mood? And can you infer what the tone is? And mood and tone are different. And what is this piece conveying to you? The reason I'm doing this is because music plays a massive role in games just auditorially and how you make sure that you know what a given situation is going on. So that's why I'm going to play these 5 for a short little bit. first one to the second one. So the next one. Fourth one. And lastly, all right. So, I mean, yeah. And if you're interested in what songs those were, I'll just put the names out there. Got Dark Souls. Oh, I forgot to change that. Final Fantasy VII. This is Pokemon Heart Gold. I don't know why that's there. Halo 1 and Doom 2016. Each came out at various different times and had various different technologies involved, but you should be able to clearly see what emotions were being conveyed through those pieces. So, music plays a major role in video games. Its presence is intended to inform and enhance the setting or situation that the player is present in. Unless intended, If a game does not have any music, the player is supposed to feel that something is missing or that the game is empty. How I want to exemplify this is here is a no music glitch in Super Mario Galaxy. In this first level, which is Good Egg Galaxy, it's a very bombastic and like welcoming environment. But when the music is taken away, you can kind of see how the whole tone shifts due to a lack of music. See with the lack of music, it's even more like a space odyssey. It's empty and distant and cold almost, which is very much not what Mario, or in this case Luigi, is that atmosphere that the game tries to present itself as. So music really plays a major role, especially in the back of the player's mind. Let's get that out there. Oops. So how does music achieve these tasks? Well, I'd classify 3 different techniques or criteria that are used to achieve it. Now, I want to point out that not every song or track in a soundtrack actually has to encompass all 3. But I mean, most really iconic pieces of music do encompass all 3 and is at least the bare minimum to achieve one of these. So number 1 is looping. Games use looping to set the mood for a region. More times than not, developers don't exactly know how long the player will stay in a given area. Because of that fact, composers orchestrate for musical arrangements to naturally flow back to the beginning. Musically, most composers set up motifs and musical ideas that will naturally flow to the beginning of the piece, and the players will be none the wiser. Naturally, these loops will include key changes and tempo changes so that the player is like pays attention throughout the entire piece. Number 2 is underscoring. Music is supposed to underscore any given situation that the player is in. The term underscoring actually originates from its use in plays and films where the music will change in intensity based on what part of the act it's in. If the player is in an action-packed sequence in a game, the music should have intensity according to that situation. And if the player is in a calming atmosphere, then the music should reflect that as well. As an example, for anyone who plays any 3D Zelda games, as you know, if you're in the overworld, there is a usually bombastic or just calming overworld theme in the case of Breath of the Wild. And the moment you enter combat, the orchestration changes and it's a completely different song that is supposed to represent fighting, and therefore it's more intense and more rhythmic. And the player is a good underscore for the player's actions at that time. And lastly, the music is supposed to grab your attention. Now, I understand that might seem antithetical to the whole underscoring, but it is in fact a necessity. When music is being played for an infinity and it is underscoring any situation, it has actually a very high chance to become stale after being listened to for 10 minutes to an hour. It is the job of any composer to maintain the musical interest of the listeners by introducing interesting elements to songs, such as key changes, shifting time signatures, changing instrumentations, accidentals, and even more into every track. It is actually even more vital when the song in question is not the focus of the player's attention, because it needs to be have just enough intrigue so that the player, they lose focus from the game for just a second because the music just sounds that interesting. And here are some examples of my personal favorites that do that, in my opinion. And we'll play them. Every other song, by the way, will only be, unless otherwise stated, will be played for about 40 to 50 seconds. Oh, I forgot. This will happen a few times. There's a lot of audio clips, so I'm going to have to refresh for some reason. I actually don't know why. So Fallen Saber in Destiny is actually played in Strike Boss, which is just like a normal boss fight in that game. And specifically to me, when I first was playing that game, this song always stuck out to me because I was like, the song is absolutely fire, considering that most Destiny songs you don't really hear, like you're not really paying attention since it's a first person shooter, you're focused on the game mechanics. I would always get distracted and try to like prolong the boss as long as possible so that I could just listen to the song on loop. Here's the next one. Gerudo Valley is also another great example. Considering Ocarina of Time and Zelda as a whole is very medievally focused, this very ethnically focused and interesting track that uses, clapping and a different, more clave-like rhythms really sticks out in all of Ocarina of Time soundtrack, and Gerudo Valley specifically has been hailed as, one of the most recognizable songs from this entire game. And Ocarina of Time, as many people who've played the game know, is a game with many very recognizable songs that came out of it. And lastly, from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And yeah, I mean, more Ardain daytime. Enough said. Very great song. It changes instrumentation a lot. It's honestly a lot busier than a lot of Xenoblade tracks, especially for like an overworld theme. But I mean, very much a Nintendo staple now that this game has been released and critically acclaimed. So these are some of my personal favorite examples. Okay, so on to the next section, creating chiptune music in the 8-bit era of games. The NES was the premier 8-bit video game console, and it had a sound chip that was capable of producing computer-generated sounds from 4 channels and a 5th channel capable of sampling small sounds. 2 of these channels were able to produce the square wave, which is the second from the top on this chart, and it's called a square wave because its wave looks like a square. Very obvious, I know. The first square wave in music was normally used as the melody, and the second square wave was normally used as the accompaniment or counter melody. Most of the time, the accompaniment, either the bass or the melody, but in some tracks, it's actually used as a counter melody, and it's just to keep, the interest in the song, especially harmonically. Another channel was used as the lower triangle wave. The triangle wave was normally used as the bass, and I mean, that's pretty much its only function normally. One channel was able to produce noise, which is not shown in this graph because there's not really a way to show noise. It's just a static noise, literally. And depending on how much you cut it off, what its velocity was, and what its pitch was, you could make sounds that resembled something like drum toms, hats, and cymbals. So it was basically percussion. The other 5th channel was able to produce small samples. By small, I mean like memory size small, like a megabyte or less. And they are also mostly used to be percussion sounds if you want like a deeper kind of drum beat kind of sound. But you don't normally see a lot of games really make use of the sample channel. What does this mean? This means that almost all the games released during the NES era or chiptune era used chiptune music, and they all have the exact same 4 instruments that were used to underscore every aspect of their game. When you think about it like that, That's actually kind of incredible, because how is it even possible to make all this kind of music with like just three instruments that could actually produce notes? In music, there's something called a triad, which is basically three notes, and they all have a relationship to each other, and that makes a chord. There are other types of chords that use just more than three notes. So it's honestly incredible how composers were able to create like complex pieces despite only having three notes to deal with at any time. And here's a visualization of the Legend of Zelda theme using a NES visualization software that I found on YouTube. And it's kind of interesting to see what each channel is doing, because like it's a very bare bones song because he had so little to work with at that time. Let's just, oh, okay. So this is the melody. This is the accompaniment, which is just acting as the echo right now. This is the triangle wave, and this is the noise acting as percussion. Oh, well, I can't turn it up. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it's kind of interesting to see how these songs were created with just so little things available to the composers. All right. Next, we're going to listen to a few examples of the diverse tracks that composers were able to create, even with these limitations. So you can see all of them right here, all the titles from all the different games, but I do want to point out, you see National Park from Pokemon Gold and Silver. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color, respectively, had a slightly different sound chip. They had 4 channels like their normal NES, but they had the use of the sine wave. I don't know why I'm pointing with my hand. The sine wave, which looks like a sign from geometry or something, I think, like that. And it kind of makes a slightly different sounding noise, and you'll be able to hear that in the track when I play it. So we'll just listen to this for about I have to refresh again, for about 40 to 50 seconds, because these songs are actually very short. Oh, my bad. All right, next, National Park, like I was talking about earlier, slightly different sound than the other ones. Next, Bloody Tears from Castlevania 2. That's about it for that one. Brinstar from Metroid. And last but certainly not least, athletic theme from Super Mario Brothers 3. So yeah, you can even tell, like, with every different song, you can hear the different kind of intensities and different themes that they're trying to convey. The National Park is obviously very calming. Athletic theme is very jovial, very bouncy. Brinstar is kind of more intense. Metal Man's kind of just a banger. Bloody Tears is also a more intense song, especially since they're fighting vampires. So, I mean, even with the same amount of instruments, they're able to convey a lot of different themes, even with just 3. So, first major analysis we're going to do is the analysis of Green Greens from Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy. I arranged it for piano, and I did that so that you can visualize how these songs were created. So if you just take a look at the sheet music, hopefully you can see my mouse. If not, that'd be kind of awkward. You can see that at any point in the song, no more than 3 instruments or 3 notes are being played on the same beat. So like here, this is a kind of dirty chord here, but there's no other things being played. So this is where these 2 squares and triangle are being played at the same time. This entire song is being played with just 3 instruments. So I'm going to play the original version, and you can just follow my mouse. If you can't read sheet music, so you can see where we are. And if you're interested, this is a repeat sign. So when you get to the end, it just goes back to here, which is looping. So yeah, we're just going to go through the entire loop of this. It's only like 30 something seconds. So see, pretty accurate arrangement, if I do say so myself. So let's do a little quick analysis on how Green Greens makes use of all the 3 musical tasks or criteria that I said earlier. It makes the use of looping. There's not any other way I can really say that. It loops, which is always good, especially in these platformers where the player might be in a level for 30 seconds, or they might be not as good at the game and be on it for 4 minutes. It underscores the light and airy mood that, Kirby games are known for. It uses staccato, quick rhythms, and its primary key or home key is C major, which is known as one of the happier keys within music. And it captures your attention by moving to C minor, as we can see right here. If I go back halfway through the song, it goes to C minor, which is 3 flats, which is the parallel minor of C major, and C minor is very intense. And honestly, it's kind of cool because it reflects how Kirby usually goes from a very light and airy game to them fighting like eldritch monsters and like gods near the end, which is kind of cool. Green Greens is actually very well written, and it's so well written that the sections of its melody have been used in Kirby games as leitmotifs, which is a shorthand for just musical ideas that you can take from one song and put them in a new key. And they've been using those leitmotifs for over 20 years in Kirby games. If you just listen to certain boss themes or certain other variations of Green Greens in the games, like every first level, Green Greens is usually the motific centerpiece of every single Kirby game and a lot of their pieces of music. So moving on to the next bit, sampling instruments to compose music in the 16-bit era. The 16-bit era of games was defined by the rivalry between Sega and Nintendo with their respective consoles, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or as we're going to shorthand it because that's very long, the SNES. These huge leaps in technology meant that sound chips were also more advanced than their 8-bit eras counterparts. So first, we're going to go over the power of the Sega Genesis sound chip. This sound chip had 9 channels, which is a huge leap from the original 4/5 if you use sampling, the sample channel. 6 of these channels had sampling capabilities, although the 6th channel was normally relegated to being a DAC channel, which is short for digital to analog, which that's not really too important to understand why it's called that. But digital to analog controller channels would normally just handle percussion, especially on the Sega Genesis. The 3 remaining channels handled chiptune sounds, and I'm not going to go all the way back to that original slide, but it also made use of the saw wave along with the pulse, square, and triangle. So the wave quadrilogy was completed with the Sega Genesis, even though the saw wave really wasn't that popular out of all the waves. It doesn't really sound as clean and as unique as the other ones. So to provide a quick example on how the Sega Genesis and SNES entire soundscape is different, let's take a look at the Guile stage theme from Street Fighter 2, which was released on both the Sega Genesis and SNES. So you can take a little look and see how they were different. All right. And the NES sound chip had, or the SNES, wow, I can't believe I put NES there. The SNES sound chip had 8 channels. All 8 channels use a sampling system, which allowed for composers to be able to add more instruments and more sounds that they wanted into the game. And I know I just threw out the word sampling even in the last slide. But what that means is that they got the sound from real instruments, recorded them, and then they became super compressed because these systems were not very powerful. And then they got implemented into the games in a manner that was way more complicated than I'd be able to explain very easily. But essentially, like, let's say you have trumpet, they would play an actual trumpet, get all the different sounds that they need for that, and then they would compress it and put it as a sound font that you can actually play in their whatever they were making the music in at the time, which we don't have access to now. It's commonly agreed that the SNES sound chip was way more powerful than the Sega Genesis, and at the same time, that sound chip was released 2 years after the Sega Genesis, so Nintendo probably found some way to optimize it that Sega just did not have the capabilities to after the Genesis was released. So we're going to listen to Guile stage on this version, and you can see the massive amount of difference that sound quality makes and that the 8 channels had in terms of, you know, creating a soundscape that sounded more realistic. Played that a little bit longer than the Sega Genesis one. That's a little bit of bias, my bad. And once again, we're going to go through 5 songs that are SNES songs specifically. There's a specific reason for that, so that you can see how the added sampling capabilities increase diversity of music and games, and you can internalize how these different, more realistic interpretations of instruments are able to evoke certain moods and settings that are just not possible for 8-bit. of that one. I would have literally kept it going if I had the choice. Here's the next one. All right. You can kind of already tell the difference. Like one's very intense and one is a lot more calming, but we got 3 more to go through. Next, a personal favorite. Hello. Oh, I have to refresh one more time. I apologize. Google does not like me, I guess. Aquatic ambience just had to do that to me. And lastly, yeah, I mean, that one completely loops. That was just kind of lucky. Next analysis is for Angel Island Zone Act 2 on the Sega Genesis, which is why I didn't do any Sega Genesis songs in the last one, because this is like a big write-up for this one. So I came to the conclusion that it would be kind of impossible for me to arrange the sheet music for Angel Island Zone Act 2. Like that would not take up like 10 different slides. So I decided to go about another approach. And I decided to write out the entire song using the Sonic 3 and Knuckles sound font within my digital audio workstation, or DAW FL Studio, to gather some information on how the song was written. And I came to the conclusion that while writing, despite the Sega Genesis only having 9 channels, the piece used 18 different instruments throughout, including like duplicates. So if there's like 2 trumpets playing, that's 2 channels. And I can show, or I can let you listen to what it originally sounds like for a second, and then I'm just gonna play my entire written out version, so you can see like how complex these songs actually were for the Sega Genesis and SNES. All right, yeah, I don't want to spoil my own thing, but yeah. And so here's my own version. What? Sir? So I just want to point out before we start, every row here is a instrument. There's only two that are, or there's a few that are like multiple. Like this bass is two basses combined because they use two for the first part for some reason. Uh, there's a square and saw, they just play on the same note, and the electric piano has two different things playing at the same time. But it's pretty much exactly how it was written out then. And there's only, they have 9 channels playing the entire time. There's never a time where there's like 8 or 7. Like they make the most out of the Sega sound chip, at least when I did it. And I had the luxury of being able to do pitch bending and being able to add like certain things like EQ and adding like reverb. But for them, they had to like hard code in some of this stuff into the sound chip. So I do not envy the process in this. So here's my rendition. So yeah, that was what I got out of it, and I found it to be really educational, and it kind of made me appreciate how these songs were put together because it's kind of insane. So yeah, so I want to also talk about how Act 2 completes all, or Angel Island Zone Act 2. That's a mouthful, honestly. Completes all the 3 musical tasks or criteria that I said much earlier. It loops, which is, very obvious, but it's kind of always helpful to point out. It loops, which is helpful, especially when you don't know how long these players are going to be on these Sonic stages, especially since Sonic is known for speed. It perfectly underscores Angel Island. It reuses many of the leitmotifs from Angel Island Zone Act 1. If you listen to that song, you'd be able to do that. But if I compared the two of them, it would go on forever. Angel Island Zone Act 1, but it's also in minor, which is really interesting because the once sunny Angel Island Zone is now on fire in this version, as you see in the picture below. It also is masterclass at maintaining the listener's attention. Sonic games are known for its speed, and their tracks must also have that kind of energy. To maintain that momentum musically, the composers change the melodies often, and they change the instrumentation also at the same time. They add interjecting phrases, and they have drastic changes depending on which section the song is in. It's also a huge departure from Act 1, like I said earlier, which had a home key of F major, while this one is C minor, much like the second half of Green Greens, which is really just a coincidence. I don't really think Sega was planning for that at all. And on to the next section, modern sampling and orchestrated soundtracks. This is where things start to get a lot more interesting to me. So the first thing we're going to do is actually have another analysis. Video games, more than any other industry, like to bank on nostalgia to make profit. It's just a fact of life. Let's just be real. But due to that inevitability, composers are able to revisit their previous works and expand upon it due to the experience and technological innovations that have surrounded them during their time composing. The gap between the Game Boy Color and the Nintendo DS led the composers of Pokemon gold, silver, and crystal be able to revive and reimagine the music in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which was 10 years later. So here we're going to listen to Ecruteak 1 from 1999, and then we're going to listen to Ecruteak 2 from 2009, and we can compare and contrast and see what different techniques they use to differentiate them from each other and how it's improved. All right, and in the next full loop, here we go. So yeah, the first most obvious thing you realized is that almost sounds like not almost, it sounds like a completely different song, which it practically is. This particular song is, Ecruteak City, which is a city surrounded by autumn leaves in the arguably most Japanese inspired region in all of Pokemon, which is Johto. The city is reminiscent of traditional Japanese cities with Japanese architecture, such as the Burn Tower and Bell Tower. The most obvious and immense difference is the sound quality and instrumentation that is present in the 2009 version of Ecruteak City. This version of the track sampled traditional Japanese instruments like the koto, taiko, biwa, and others, and this helped to reinforce the Japanese aesthetic. And if you listen closely, the song is actually the exact same melody as the original, just at a slower tempo with slightly changed rhythms in some places. And as per usual, the songs I pick are great examples of completing the 3 musical criteria. It loops. I mean, there's no other reason for me to stick on that bullet point anymore. Its instrumentation and alteration of the original Ecruteak City structure perfectly underscores this Japanese-inspired city, like I already said earlier. And it's also very great at commanding the attention of the listener. It has a completely original and more Asian-inspired introduction that maintains that traditional feeling. And each section of the melody has completely different instrumentation, with some sections completely omitting percussion and some adding staccato strings and much more if we could really take a deep dive into it. But it's just a quick analysis and how in 10 years, music has changed dramatically for games, and sampling especially, to the point where it actually sounds like how the composers probably originally wanted it to at that time. All right. modern sampling and blending. Thanks to modern digital audio workstations, or DAWs, and MIDIs, or musical instrument digital interfaces, fledgling composers are allowed to sample realistic instruments with very little effort. In fact, many games, until fairly recently, were made solely out of sampled instruments. A Link Between Worlds on the 3DS is one of those games. Released in 2013, its composer stated that a fully orchestrated soundtrack would have not sounded good on the 3DS speakers due to the reverb that would be on the lower sounding, or the lower tenored instruments. So like things like the bass and like drums, the reverb would have sounded really poorly on the 3DS speakers. So they chose to have a completely sampled computer generated soundtrack. But even due to this, it's almost impossible to tell the difference unless somebody actually told you. So take a quick listen to that. Oh my God. It's like I had a record of 4 refreshes, but I think I'm on 6 or something. Oh. In addition to sampling, modern tools allow for composers to add unrealistic synths and alter the sounds of instruments to create entirely new sounds. The 2 tracks below are a masterclass in demonstrating how you can blend sampling and live orchestras to create unique sounds and soundtracks. This is from Monster Hunter World, obviously. This is from Destiny 2. If anyone got to that raid, which I doubt people did actually. So yeah, you can hear those synths in the background, and those are an example of how you can blend electronic instruments with live orchestration. And then Destiny 2 is a more heavy-handed approach. You can hear there are some strings in there that are playing at speeds I don't think normal violinists can play at, not to mention their reverb is cut off, and it makes a really interesting sound, especially in the context of Destiny, where the darkness is very commonly portrayed as having an electric and more lo-fi kind of sound. And this is a cross between them because it's a like corrupted enemy in the context of the game. Yeah, that's a great example. Due to the limitations of consoles, sampling was the main way to create sounds that were similar to the real things. But now composers can hire orchestras to play their pieces how they were originally written. Xenoblade Chronicles was a game released on the Nintendo Wii in 2010. At that time, the game was not able to support a live orchestra, but its remaster in 2020, the composers came back together to completely to completely remake the entire soundtrack with a live orchestra and a host of new effects and samples. A live orchestra sound is usually more desirable because it sounds more natural. Even though samples can sound exactly like the real thing, an actual human playing has slight mistakes and different, I wouldn't say mistakes, but slight little differences that make it sound more alive and more natural than something fake. So we're just gonna take a listen to, I have to refresh again. Being punished. To Gower Plains from the Wii version, which is the left, and then the definitive edition, and you should be able to tell a little bit of difference. Yeah, if I had any sense, I would have kept playing, but we do have a time. And here's the next version. You should be able to tell it sounds a little bit more fuller, and the percussion is a little bit more subdued because it's actually not computer generated percussion samples. So one last listen. Ooh. So yeah, with that, you can tell the difference between, hopefully you can tell the difference between a sampled version of Gower Plains and the live orchestrated one that was 10 years later. See, 10 years was, I think 10 years is just like the thing, like it's a world of difference. It turns out that just was coincidence. And below are some examples of the more modern video game soundtracks. These make use of samples, live orchestration, and other modern composing and arranging techniques to make something a little bit more cinematic. When we talk about games, we like to talk about how they've advanced graphically and technically. And with that, the games have strived to become more like movies and films, and that has become evident and reflected in their music. So we're going to use these as examples. God of War came out in 2018. Final Fantasy Remake came out earlier this year, and Red Dead Redemption 2 also came out in 2018. So you can hear how games that came out 2 years ago have a soundtrack that is very reflective of cinema. And then bombing missions from Final Fantasy VII Remake, which honestly, when I think about it, I should have compared the original with this one, but I mean, the point still stands. And lastly, American Venom from Red Dead Redemption 2. So yeah. And the last category, new is old and old is new. The indie game scene has brought back the retro style of game to the forefront of people's minds. And with that, the chiptune and 16-bit style of sound and music. So with modern tools, composers are able to improve retro tracks by adding features like reverb, changing EQ, panning to different sides of the speakers, and adding custom filters, plugins, and other add-ons to their digital audio workstations. These features completely modernize these soundtracks while making them still feel retro. We're going to listen to Heartache from Undertale and High Above the Land from Shovel Knight. Fun fact, I've never played these games, but I've listened to their entire soundtracks over 10 times. So that's kind of weird. So yeah, we'll listen to Heartache first, and then we'll talk about it, and then we'll talk about High Above the Land first, and then listen to it, because that's the order I did this in. Huh? Oh my God. Okay. Refresh number 8 or something. I apologize. But if I had the choice, I wouldn't be doing that. One last time. So yeah, in Heartache, you can hear that originally it starts off as a classic chiptune song with just the square and triangle and noise channels, but soon it adds in more sampled instruments, and with those sampled instruments, more computer generated effects that completely modernizes the sound and creates this very unique sound that a lot of retro games really should replicate, honestly. It's really interesting to see how Toby Fox, revolutionized chiptune with adding actual instruments into it and just blending them all together. High Above the Land from Shovel Knight, on the other hand, generally sticks with the chiptune style and those instruments. However, it very often uses way more than just 3 sounds and 4 channels. They actually use way more, probably about 8 in the most intense versions of the song, which really give this a more full sound than what the NES was capable of at the time. So we'll listen to a little bit of this also. So yeah, that's enough said. It's a lot fuller than normal NES style of music. And another game that has a way more improved soundtrack than the original, Sonic Mania, while actually produced by Sega and therefore not exactly indie, its team was largely fan made, or a team of fans of Sonic who ended up being hired by Sega. So I'll give it a little half credit there. Their soundtrack made use of classic Sega Genesis sounds, but they also sampled more realistic instruments along with computer-generated audio effects to create an entirely new style for the retro style of Sonic, which I hope Sega brings back. I mean, seriously. And here's two versions of the track. Flying Battery Zone Act 2 from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and 23 years later, Flying Battery Zone Act 2 from Sonic Mania. That's the original version, just 41 seconds, and then the improved T. Lopes version, which is godlike. So yeah, you can see that he actually doubled the length of the song, added a actual electric guitar and his own unique version of like a little interjecting phrase there. I mean, completely retrofitted Flying Battery Zone Act 2 and didn't have that screeching thing from the beginning. Like to see it. So, takeaways. I think some key takeaways from this presentation are how complex it was to create music back then, especially for the NES when you just had 4 channels to deal with. And also that music has taken some giant leaps in terms of sound quality and composition quality. Composers really had to stretch the limits of music theory to successfully add to the player's experience by creating interesting and memorable tracks that will be memorized and remembered for years to come. And another key takeaway, I think, is that some of these retro sounds are so iconic that fans and people who really love these games actually go out of their way to recreate these limitations so that they can create something that sounds authentic. So thank you for listening to my presentation. Hopefully you learned something about music, and hopefully you like go out of your way to listen to some game soundtracks at some point, because there's definitely some heat in there that you're missing. Specifically, Kirby really has good music. I don't know why, they really do. So yeah, thank you. And I don't know what's next. I think I opened for questions, right?
Yeah, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
What were the song, like you had the slide with the 5 songs?
Oh, in the beginning?
Yeah, in the very beginning where you didn't
Okay.
list the names, I think.
Yeah,
Could you-
I can do that again.
Yeah.
Let me reshare. Hold on a second. Let me just do the screen. Just let me just. This is not Final Fantasy VII. That's a typo. It's Pokemon Heart Gold or something. So yeah, those are the main ones from the beginning.
Thanks.
I think there were some questions in the chat from earlier.
Yeah, I now see there's 88 whatevers.
Oh yeah.
I didn't yeah, I couldn't see it.
I think I tried keeping track of them. Margaret asked it says how much of the cartridge memory they had to use on this, but
Okay,
I
so
forget what they were talking about.
I know for the Sega Genesis and SNES, they said the sound chip only had 64 megabytes of memory, which is insane to me, because that means they had to make a bunch of stuff on 64 megabits. Like, to put it into perspective, if I made an empty project in FL Studio, it's almost 30 times that, just with no instruments or anything in there. So that just kind of shows how insane it was. And especially back then, if you wanted to have like reverb or something, instead of having just like a software do that for you, you would just put another instrument at a lower volume and like slightly delay it so that it sounds like there's like an echo. So there's a lot of kind of intricate stuff like that and how they composed back then.
And then I think they also asked if the dynamic range, like the loud, soft, loud in the Donkey Kong Country sample was like actually in the file.
In. Yeah, it's programmed in. They didn't have any way to they didn't have any digital audio workstations back then. That's a relatively new invention, a relatively new like widespread thing. So that was something that's been added. Like, they had to manually code into the sound chips, which is kind of insane.
I have like a small one, because I grew up playing Sonic Heroes on the original Xbox, and the soundtrack is still like very iconic to me. But I was wondering, like, how are the sound chips like on those consoles compared to the ones that you already talked about?
Yeah, so there was I missed a slight thing in my notes where I was talking about for sampling after like the SNES and Sega Genesis. There was the descriptions of stuff were a lot more muddied because there wasn't like a specific console generation that you can go to. So I'd like to say that like with the introduction of like PCs and stuff, like obviously Halo was a PC game, like a very early PC game, yet it had a live orchestrated soundtrack, which is just because a PC has like a more powerful sound chip than a Sega Genesis or a Nintendo DS. So for stuff like Sonic Heroes, which released on the Xbox is Microsoft, and Microsoft overloads their sound chips every year. So that's why you could have stuff like Crush 40 singing a live song, because like that was actually live orchestrated then. And granted, they had samples and everything, but in their live, in their vocal stuff, that was all recorded live for the most part, especially for Sonic, where they put all their budget into that most of the time. Oh yeah, I see a question. Is there an easy way to play around with these tools ourselves? See, that's the main thing. Honestly, unless you have a Mac, no, because certain DAWs you can use like Logic and like FL Studio, which costs $120. I would never suggest getting FL Studio on the first time. And stuff like Cubase and all the stuff that composers use, these are all professional tools, and there's nothing that's out right now where people can be like, oh, I want to make a 16-bit-esque song, or maybe something with live orchestration, because this is coming from somebody who has a wish list of like a bunch of samples I want. If you want like realistic string samples, well, you're cashing out $2,000. I don't think anyone wants to cash out $2,000 for something that they might use like once or twice. And there's no like free database for that, since only very few companies have enough resources to be able to sample an instrument. Because like how sampling works, especially now since it's so realistic, you would have to sample a violin just for one note. You have to sample like any intonation that it could possibly have. So staccato, legato. Is the bow being pressed hard? Is it being pressed lightly? Are you at the end of the bow? Are you at the tip? Is there vibrato? How long is it being played? Is it a quarter note? Is it a half note? What tempo is it at? So they literally have millions of samples for just one instrument, and then they multiply that by how many instruments they're going to add into a pack. And that's why you can't have like super realistic samples. Now, sound fonts for like retro games, those are completely free and you can find those online. But being able to like implement them into other softwares, you need the digital audio workstations for that, which is really the key expensive part, which is really annoying for people who like want to get into composing, but like they don't know if they can afford to like even try to jump in at first, which I think is something that needs to be kind of fixed. There should be like an easy access way to get into it, like an Sprite for composing, if I may make that comparison. Yeah, thank you for coming out. I mean, I really prepared a lot for this one. And I mean, hopefully it was very educational.
Very good.
I think it's cool. Yeah, I just find this stuff interesting myself. That's why I wanted to do it. So
I have a question in chat. What's your favorite OST?
oh, I don't have one. I literally don't, because it changes every week. I mean, I literally listen to video game music more than like anything that comes on the radio or like Spotify or anything. Recently, because I've been doing research, like I'd say Hollow Knight right now, or Hollow Knight, Shovel Knight. Hollow Knight's still very high up there. But like, I mean, High Above the Lands is something that I listen to in my free time now. I never listened to that soundtrack until recently, and it's disgusting. Like, I mean, it's just really good. I think Destiny also has a really good soundtrack to me, but people like, not a lot of people like play Destiny, especially Destiny 1. Like people slept on the soundtrack, but I like there's some heat in there that people just locked away behind raids. People didn't play the raids. Unfortunate.
Does any last questions for Noah?
I mean, also, if anyone wants like a recommendation for a soundtrack, if they want one, I am like the encyclopedia. I am the database. If you're like, I need something, I got you. Like, it's like my thing.
Nice. What's the best way to contact you for that?
I think my email probably. I can just put that. My email or on Discord. It's like shoot me a DM or something. I can put my email in here though. Parable to the Bit Trip OSTs. I gotta. That I'm gonna need to do some research, but I can get back to you. Like lickety split. That's something I'm interested in. Some super peppy chip tunes. I think the newest Shovel Knight actually has a really like peppy thing, and like the Super Mario Bros. 2 has a really like peppy chiptune soundtrack, especially since nobody plays Super Mario Brothers 2. Like that's a very odd one. But yeah, if you contact my email if you want to get into, I literally have dozens of playlists on YouTube where I just go through the whole thing. Like I just have it all.
Okay, so I will assume that's it. So thank you so much, Noah, for the really, really in-depth presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I think we all really enjoyed it. We learned a lot from it. Thank you so much once again.